Welcome back to another episode of the Devoted Creators Podcast. Today is a slightly different episode. I wanted to do something in between season 1 and season 2 where I could talk to you guys about some of the things I've learned in the process of creating the podcast. This is my first ever solo podcast as well, so there was a lot of things going into it that I didn't know, some mistakes I made quite early on, some things I've learned, and I wanted to share those with you guys. And I think I get a lot of questions from obviously people who listen, but also friends of mine who are creative people who wanted to start their own podcast at some point and are still struggling with that process. So while I've helped some of those people individually, I thought it'd be quite cool to share some of those things with a much broader audience, because I'm sure I've still got a lot to learn. So I'm sure there's some things maybe I can answer for you guys by opening this conversation. And if you do have any comments or questions and you're watching this on YouTube or listening to some clips on Instagram, then feel free to send me a DM on Gadgets John or just leave a comment down below. But let's get into the starting point. How do you start a podcast? Where do you go when you have the idea? Even coming up with the idea actually can be quite hard, and I think a lot of people, one of the biggest mistakes I've seen people make anyway, when I've worked on other podcasts for other people, is people start a podcast with all the right intentions. They've got an interesting idea, or they've got an interesting group of friends, or a friend dynamic that they think would work good in a podcast format. And I think you kind of have to think a bit further than just, we've got a bit of chemistry here, let's record this. Sometimes that can be great, and you might make a couple of episodes out of it, but having something consistent that people will keep listening to and we'll be able to develop and evolve into something that's worth people following and keeping up with, there's normally a piece missing there where if you haven't done that bigger thinking, what is this podcast's purpose? What is the purpose, of this podcast? If you haven't thought about that, then I think you're going to struggle with keeping it interesting for yourself and also for the listeners. But I think most importantly, one of the things I've learned in this process, and the reason why I feel like what we're doing here works quite well, is I'm genuinely interested in the point of this podcast. The whole point is I want to help other people understand all the different ways into the creative worlds that people I know and creative people that I've had the fortune of meeting have found. And I think the fact that I'm genuinely interested in that subject makes listening to it a lot more enjoyable. So that would be my first suggestion or piece of advice, is come up with a podcast, come up with a reason for doing the podcast that's much bigger than this is a fun chat that I have with a friend of mine regularly, and I think other people might find it fun too. There can be that can be a really great starting point, but try and make the idea bigger. Try and come up with a theme that you guys can meet around and have a conversation around each month or each week, however often you decide to do it. But I think you need a really solid why for the reason that you're doing it. Podcast has to have purpose. First piece of advice. Second piece of advice, and I think this is probably one of the most important pieces of advice, is actually, don't worry about equipment. Don't get caught up in needing to buy a fancy camera, the biggest microphone, the best whatever. Don't get caught up in kit. I think very often that can be one of the reasons why a lot of us don't get started, is because we don't even know where to start when it comes to equipment. And I've had this conversation with a few people, start with a camera that that you find easy to turn on and operate, that isn't complicated for you to use, because one of the biggest issues I think people will find early on is if it's too technical, if it's a lot of work to get set up and get going, that can also put you off being consistent because it's a lot of effort. And I think the more barriers you put up for yourself in terms of being able to have that conversation, then the tougher you're going to find it to keep it consistent. So make the kit as simple for you as possible. I happen to be a full-time content creator. This is what I do for a living. So I'm very fortunate that I have access to a lot of equipment, and I have a 3-camera setup for my podcast. I have some lighting in this studio that I can use. I'm actually not using any right now because I wanted to make this kind of as bare bones as possible, just one mic, one camera. But I use Rotolight lighting for my podcast, and I use the Lumix S5 II and 2 Lumix S5 II X's for the podcast, mainly because they don't overheat, which is great for me because I tend to have quite long conversations. But also the autofocus on them is great. I love the color that I get out of them. So for me, these cameras do the job that I need for the kind of podcast that I have, with two people talking, having three cameras, a main camera that's on the two of us, and then a camera that's on me and a camera that's on my guest, that kind of crossover. I think that works quite well just for cutting in between, focusing on different parts of the conversation. A multi-camera setup for my podcast works very well, but that isn't necessarily going to be the case for you. One mistake I made quite early on when I thought I need to go out and buy all of this fantastic kit to make the podcast, I went out and bought this piece of kit here, which is covered in dust. This is the Rodecaster Pro 2, which is, I believe, an amazing piece of kit, but I've not even taken the plastic off of it. It's still box fresh. Well, I've taken it out of the box and I tried to set it up and it was too much. As I said before, if you're putting up a lot of barriers between yourself and being able to hit record and create your content, that may be a barrier for you getting started. And so for me, this piece of kit, as amazing as I'm sure it is, it was an unnecessary barrier for me to get the conversation going. I've already got cameras that can record audio. I've got a audio interface that plugs into the main camera anyway, that has a hot shoe XLR mic plugged into it. And I can go from that camera's XLR into a piece of kit that was a really good investment. The Mix Pre 3 from Sound Devices. This piece of kit, which is really tiny, you can see it down here. See it there? The Mix Pre 3 2 from Sound Devices has three XLR inputs, an aux in and headphone out and some monitoring. But it's a really simple piece of kit. I plug in the mics, I hit record. It has 32-bit float, so I don't have to worry about volume going too loud and peaking and ruining the audio. But this is a great little piece of kit. I can run it off mains power. I can also run it off batteries because I bought the adapter for it. But, these two pieces of kit, like this doesn't look that serious. This looks like a proper, if you're just listening, you can't see, but the Mix Pre 3 is about the size of two iPhones side by side. The Rodecaster Pro 2 it looks like a proper podcasting mixing desk. It's a really serious piece of kit, I'm sure. But again, I've never been able to get the most out of it because it doesn't work with what I'm working with. And it was a big expense that, I have to just take on the chin because I thought I needed it. You don't necessarily need all of the kit. Another piece of kit I wanted to shout out was the Saramonic Blink Me B2 microphones, which come in this cool little carry case, and there they are there. And they're magnetically attached, to your chest or whatever you're wearing. And the thing I love about these is they've got a really nice screen on them, so I can stick my logo from the podcast on this. And so for clips that go viral, which we've had a couple of, the guest is wearing a microphone with the logo on the actual mic. So I don't have to worry about people remixing the clips and losing my branding. That stays in the video because it's part of the video. So that is a really cool piece of kit that I absolutely love. Really nice wireless audio mics. And I do tend to use at least two sources for my audio. And the reason for that is because of redundancy. Because you never know what might go wrong. You may hit record on one thing and not hit record on the other. You might, I don't know, something can go wrong. And so I think it's always good to have some redundancy, whether that is with your audio and with your video feed or one or the other. Because I use multiple cameras and I use multiple audio sources, I'm kind of covered if something goes wrong. And so that is something I would recommend you would try and do as well. Have two sources for audio, preferably an external audio source that's completely separate, like the Mix Pre 3 2. And then you have your audio connected directly to your main camera. If you have more than one camera, then, there's other solutions for that too. But pretty much every camera has onboard audio, so that's not too much of a problem. So yeah, I highly recommend this piece of kit. Absolutely loved it, the Saramonic Blink B2 and the Mix Pre 3 2. And then also this mic that I'm using right here is the Blue Sonar from Logitech. They were kind enough to actually gift me a couple of these, which I haven't used much in the podcast because I was waiting for the second arm to come. But I'm going to be using these more in season 2. I like to experiment with the setup because I'm never really quite satisfied with what I've got. I always think there's ways to improve it. So if you've watched season 1 of the Devoted Creators podcast and you're looking closely, you might notice there's some slight things change pretty much every episode. I use a different type of mic. Maybe in a couple of the earlier episodes, I was using handheld mics because I thought it might be a good way to get people to be active when they're speaking. I feel like maybe for some people that's a bit distracting, so I've gone to more towards clip-on mics because then they're not thinking too much about, their hands. But then the problem with clip-on mics is people wear jewelry and they move around, and sometimes the audio then can get messed up. So then I have a hot shoe mic, which is always on my main camera, and that picks up, it's quite directional, so it picks up everything that it's pointing at. And pointing at the couch, it means I always have a backup audio that can pick up both people. So that's kind of my solution for audio. And as I mentioned, you'll notice these things change as every episode goes because I'm a perfectionist. I always think there's ways to improve it. And my third or fourth, I don't know what kind of number tips I'm on, but one of the other tips I would definitely recommend is watch and or listen to your episodes back, because you will do and you will say things that are really jarring for your audience. And if you're not watching and listening to your episodes back, you won't be able to pick up on those. And I think as the creator doing the content, you're going to be more sensitive to it because you're watching it back, and we're all very judgy of ourselves. It took me ages to actually listen to my podcast back for the first time, but do it. 100% recommend doing it because it will help you improve. You'll learn that there are some things that maybe opportunities, like if you're doing an interview, for example, I noticed in some of my earlier episodes, because I was interviewing people that I knew, I sometimes would assume people know the information, and I would not ask a follow-up question that could reveal something really interesting to the audience that I already knew as somebody who knows that guest. And so listening back to my episodes and actually talking to some of my friends, a friend of mine, Richard Sibley, he gave me some really good advice about that in particular, actually realizing that there are things that I could maybe ask a bit further and ask people how those particular moments made them feel, how they coped with things. He gave me some really good advice. So yeah, also rely on your friends. If you've got some friends that are kind enough to listen to your content, then ask them for feedback. Ask them how they enjoyed it. What did they think you could improve on? I think that's a really good it's a really good thing to have friends that will share advice and be kind when you've done something that maybe you could improve and do better on. So yeah, share it, listen back to your podcast, watch them back as well. I know that's hard because I can't stand watching myself on camera, but you get over it. It's what we do. So that would be another piece of advice that I would share with you guys. What else is there that I think is important? Booking guests. One of the hardest things, especially if you have a podcast that does involve having guests, one of the hardest parts is getting people to actually come and record, because most people, even just out of politeness, will agree to do an episode. And especially if they're friends of yours, they'll be up for it and they'll say they will, but then actually getting them to commit to a time and getting them to come to wherever you do record, or if you do it online, getting them to commit to a time where they can sit down and chat with you for 20 minutes or half an hour or however long your podcast is, it can be a challenge. So I would say try to record more episodes than you're willing to put out. I tend to put out my episodes on a monthly basis, so I try to record 2 every month. That hasn't been possible for this year. I'm going to try and do that more next year for season 2, so I'm more on top of it. I've actually got 4 guests already lined up. I'm going to start recording those before I share them, at least 2 in advance, and then I can give myself a bit more leeway. But I think, booking guests, you're going to have to work hard at committing people and try and book more than one person for the time slots that you have, because people will drop out, things come up. These are... I'm hopefully assuming the people that you're going to be talking to are really interesting people that have interesting lives. So things will come up and people will have to cancel, and that's okay. Don't get mad about it. It's part of the process. I think if you're prepared, then it's not too big a deal. And also, a next piece of advice that kind of rolls into quite neatly is don't be too hard on yourself. If you set yourself of, I'm going to do a weekly podcast, 1 episode every week, which is quite a crazy, I think that's insane, personally. I used to be part of a daily podcast for Spotify, and we used to batch record those episodes to get that done, because it is really hard to consistently put out an episode every week. So I wouldn't recommend doing it, but if you're that kind of person and you're crazy, then don't be too hard on yourself if 1 week you can't put out an episode for whatever reason. Maybe some personal things that come up for you as well. Give yourself the leeway to be as creative and as productive as you're able to be. So if things come up, if people cancel and you can't bring in another guest in time, That's okay. Don't get stressed. If anything, if you can, try and make a short filler episode that you can share with your audience in that week that doesn't involve a guest, just to update them on what you're doing. Let them know that you've got a guest coming who couldn't make it this week. That may be a way, if you're feeling under pressure to absolutely put one every week, maybe do something of a shorter length that's more doable for you, more achievable. I think that is another thing that can get to people, especially creatives. If we don't meet our targets that we set ourselves, we can get quite down on ourselves very easily. And it's really important not to beat up on yourself as much as it's nature to push yourself to want to do things and be better. That's a good thing. By all means, always strive to be better, but don't do it to your detriment. Don't beat yourself up. And I'm telling you guys this because I do it to myself. So I'm sharing you advice that I should also be listening to, and I'm trying to listen to all the time. What else do we need to share with you guys? When I wanted to do this, I had so many ideas of things that I thought, these guys would love to hear this. But I should have made notes. Make notes. Another piece of advice. Make notes if you're going to have a conversation that's extended and it's with somebody new. Especially if you're interviewing someone, do your research. Don't ask them inane questions that you could have looked up the answers to. If you want them to talk about something, get them to share the information. Don't just go in assuming that other people know everything about this person because you do. Again, it comes back to me interviewing friends. There's always going to be points in a conversation where somebody shares an experience and they've told you what happened. But one of the best things, and for me, one of the most interesting things to listen to, are the questions around what happened. How did you get there? How did that experience make you feel? How did you deal with it? What did you learn from that experience? One of the questions that came to me when I was speaking to Otis in the last episode of season 1, Otis Dealey, he talked about being a presenter for multiple decades. He's built a whole career, and one of the questions that came to me while I was talking to him, because he is quite orientated around his family. He's a great father, and one of the questions that came to me was, how did becoming a parent change you as a creative person? And everything that he said off the back of that for me was fascinating and inspiring. And it's taking the time to really listen to what people are saying and then thinking about how those experiences impact them and what other experiences around those things that they've been through might also impact them. There are lessons in all of that we can learn from. And if you're able to unpick those lessons from people, that is what's going to make your podcast something that other people want to listen to regularly, and also something that other people want to share with others. I think that is really, really important. Actually, sorry, I have ADHD, by the way, so if I jump around, that's part of the reason why. And I'm not going to edit this, so I apologize in advance that this isn't as smooth or as straightforward as I would have loved it to be, but I want you guys to have it as raw and as real as it came out of me. So one of the other reasons why I use the Lumix S52 and S52X is because they can shoot at 6K resolution. One of the benefits of shooting at 6K resolution is I can have a horizontal frame for YouTube and all of those traditional landscape style formats. But then I can also have a 2K vertical frame that I can crop into for YouTube Shorts, or for Instagram, or for TikTok when I make my clips. And that is a really, really big benefit for creating stuff that helps drive traffic to your podcast, because especially with my podcast, it's quite long generally. And having nice clips that are 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, or a minute that I can pull that work perfectly vertically. I don't have to do anything different to them. I don't have to shoot with my camera sideways. I can shoot with everything normal, and I've got all the formats that I want because I can shoot in 6K. So if that's something your camera or your phone is capable of, that is something I would definitely recommend experimenting with. It does mean your file sizes will be bigger and you'll have to invest in more storage, but in terms of workflow, I find that works really well. And another piece of a kit that I did invest in that made a massive difference to my editing workflow and just my general peace of mind when it comes to working on video content is I did get an M1 Max MacBook Pro, which is now a couple of years old, but it means I can get through quite high resolution video files without too much work very easily. If you're able to upgrade to one of the newer MacBook Pros, then you're going to get through that content even more easily. Anything, like I said, anything that makes reduces the barriers to you being able to create the content that you want, will help you be more consistent. So save for a good computer that can edit the content, or get a good phone that can edit the content as well. Those are where the investments, I think, they really pay off, because it's all good and well recording something, but if you don't have the means to edit it and cut it into different formats, again, that's going to be another barrier that stops you from being able to share some content that you absolutely love and enjoyed making. If you've enjoyed making it, then hopefully other people enjoy consuming it. So I think that's, make it easy to edit and share, and investing in a laptop that was decent at the time. I mean, it's still great for what I'm doing, but investing in a laptop that is spec'd to deliver the kind of things that you're going to be editing. For me, it's 6K video files. That laptop works great. If you've got a much bigger production or more cameras than that, maybe you need a more powerful laptop. I don't know. I'm sure there's other things that I've forgotten to share with you guys. And like I said, if you do have any comments after listening to this or while you're listening to this, please let me know in the comment section, or send me a DM on Instagram, GadgetsJohn, or send me a message on YouTube if you're watching it there. Wherever you're messaging it, leave me a comment, leave me some feedback. I really appreciate it. And it's always good to hear from you guys, because I genuinely don't know who listens to this show otherwise. So every piece of feedback that you give me, I really appreciate. Everyone who's followed me, I really appreciate the fact that you've given the time to listen to something that is as long as our podcast is each episode. Also, let me give a shout out to a couple of people. There are some people and brands that have encouraged me in this process of starting my own podcast. Firstly, I've got to start with the Spotify team that I worked with. Amazing people there. Something Else, the production company that brought me into Spotify, I really appreciate those guys as well. Amazing producers, amazing professionals there that really helped me out when I was starting in this podcast world. And they, in a lot of ways, inspired me to get my own show off the ground. So massive shout out to those guys. Also shout out to Logi and to Lumix, who also have been a massive help and support in encouraging me to just create my own content and to put stuff out there that is me. Because a lot of the stuff that I make is for other brands and for other clients, and I don't do enough from my own perspective. So this podcast is kind of a way of me doing that. But it's a real blessing to have an outlet where I can speak from my perspective and I can ask questions from really interesting and creative professionals that I admire. So everyone who's listened and encouraged me and supported, massive shout out to you guys too. I'll catch up with you all in season 2, which will be starting very soon. Thank you all for listening. Stay well, stay safe, and I'll see you in another episode.